In the year 1700, one nation produced nearly a quarter of everything the entire world made. Not Britain, not France, not the combined empires of Europe. India. For centuries before a single British soldier set foot on her soil, India was not a sleeping giant. She was a roaring one. Her cotton was so fine that Roman writers called it woven air. Her cities hummed with the sound of 10,000 looms. Her merchants moved pepper, silk, indigo, and muslin across Arabia, China, and the Mediterranean, threading the ancient world together with Indian thread. In 1600, India's per capita income stood at more than 60% of England's, a staggering figure for a civilization that Europeans would later describe in their own written records as backward and in need of saving. This is the story of how that world was taken apart, deliberately, systematically, and with full knowledge of what was being destroyed. It began not with armies, but with a company. The British East India Company arrived on Indian shores in 1608 as a trading outfit, a group of merchants who wanted spices and cloth. They bowed before Mughal emperors, they paid duties, they negotiated on bended knee. For over 100 years, they were guests in a house that did not belong to them. But guests have a way of watching, measuring, waiting. By the mid-18th century, the Mughal Empire had begun to fracture. Regional governors pulled away from Delhi. The vast and ancient and fiercely alive was also vulnerable, and Robert Clive of the East India Company saw it. On the 23rd of June, 1757, on a muddy plain near a village called Plassey in Bengal, everything changed. The Nawab of Bengal, Sir Ayuddha-Dola, commanded an army of nearly 18,000 men. Clive brought 3,000. By any calculation of war, the outcome was already written, and it was not written in Clive's favor. But Siraj-ud-Dowla's own commander-in-chief, Mir Jafar, had already been bought. He stood on that battlefield with his soldiers and did not move. 40 minutes later, it was over. The richest province in India, Bengal, a land that alone accounted for more wealth than most European nations, had fallen into the hands of a trading company, not a king, not an empire, a company. What followed was not governance, it was extraction. The company had been given what was called the Diwani rights of Bengal, the right to collect tax revenue from the land. In the hands of a responsible sovereign, that right feeds roads, hospitals, armies, and schools. In the hands of the East India Company, it fed one thing: profit. In the very first years after Plassey, company officials poured out of Calcutta into the countryside. They had not come to build, they had come with ledgers. Land taxes were fixed at impossible rates. Farmers who could not pay lost their land. Weavers who once sold their cloth to the world were now forced to sell only to company agents at prices the company itself set. If they refused, or if they defaulted, they faced penalties of 35% on advances already taken, enforced by soldiers. The looms were still running, but the men at them were no longer free. Then came 1770. The monsoon failed across Bengal. The fields dried. The grain stored against such disasters, the reserves that had protected Bengal through droughts for generations, had already been depleted. The company had been extracting grain for export. The stores were gone. And as millions began to starve, the East India Company did not reduce its tax demands. 10 million people died. a third of Bengal's population. Entire villages were found empty, the houses still standing. Fields lay fallow because there was no one left to farm them. And in the following year, company revenue records showed only a modest decline. The taxes had kept coming, even from the dying. The destruction of Bengal was not an exception. It was a rehearsal. Across India, the same logic was being applied to her greatest industry, textiles. For a century, Indian weavers clothed the world. The muslin of Dhaka was so delicate that it was traded under names like woven air and running water. Indian cotton dominated European markets so thoroughly that British wool merchants lobbied Parliament in desperation, and Parliament listened. Import duties on Indian textiles in Britain climbed to prohibitive heights. Indian cloth was systematically blocked from the very markets it had built. Then came the machines. The Industrial Revolution filled British factories with mechanical looms that could produce cloth at a fraction of the cost of a human hand. And those machine-made textiles were now flooded into India, not through fair competition, but through a colonial administration that taxed Indian-made goods while allowing British imports to flow in nearly free. The result was not a market shift, it was a demolition. Between 1800 and 1600, textile exports from India fell by 98%. British textile imports into India surged by 6,300%. The weavers who survived the taxes walked away from their looms forever. Some went to the fields, some simply vanished from the records. India's share of global industrial output fell from 25% in 1750 to just 2% by 1900. A civilization that had clothed the earth now could not clothe itself. There was a man who tried to put a number on it. Dadabhai Naoroji, a Parsi intellectual from Bombay, the first Indian ever elected to the British Parliament, spent decades building what he would call the drain of wealth theory. He pored through trade records, tax ledgers, and government accounts, and arrived at a conclusion that was simple and devastating. India was not merely being governed by Britain. India was being pumped dry. The money collected as taxes did not build Indian roads. It paid British salaries for officers who would retire to England. It funded British wars from Afghanistan to China to Africa, wars India had no part in choosing. It purchased British goods that undercut Indian markets. Half of India's annual revenue was being exported to foreign hands. In 1922 alone, 64% of the revenue raised from Indian taxes was used to fund British Indian troops deployed outside India's borders, fighting British wars on Indian money. Naoroji called it poverty. He called it un-British, and he said it plainly in the halls of Westminster to the men who had built this system. Some of them listened, most did not. The drain continued for nearly 200 years. By the time India reclaimed her independence on the 15th of August, 1947, the accounting was complete. A nation that had held 23% of the world's economy at the beginning of the 18th century walked out of colonialism with just over 3%. A civilization that had exported the finest cloth on earth now had to import needles. The infrastructure the British had built, the railways, the telegraph, the ports, had been built to move Indian resources out of India, not to connect Indians to each other. The looms were silent, the granaries were empty, and the company that had arrived as a guest bowed before emperors and asked politely to the right to trade, had taken, by the most conservative historical estimates, trillions of dollars of wealth across 2 centuries of rule.
There is a phrase the ancient world used for India, a phrase that appears in the accounts of traders from Rome, from Arabia, from China, in the accounts of men who had seen every great civilization on earth and still caught their breath when they arrived on Indian shores. They called her Sone Kichidia, the golden bird. And when it was over, the cage was all that remained.